On the morning of October 14th, a discovery was made at Cedar Hills Medical Center that shocked all of Los Angeles and made even seasoned detectives shudder. Dennis Cole had been working as a technician in the hospital morgue for 8 years. During that time, he had seen everything, but what happened that Tuesday morning forever changed his perception of the place he considered his second home. As usual, he opened one of the large freezers to retrieve a body that was to be transferred to the funeral home, but Dennis discovered something unimaginable. Instead of the expected single body of an elderly man who had died the day before of a heart attack, there were 3 people in the freezer. 2 of them were not listed in any of the morgue's records. Dennis stood frozen for a few seconds, unable to believe his eyes, and then rushed to check the neighboring freezers. The picture became increasingly horrific. 5 of the 12 freezers contained bodies that were not recorded in the morgue's logs. In total, he counted 11 unaccounted bodies. Dennis's hands trembled as he dialed the emergency response number. Detective Aisha King received the call at 9:30 in the morning. She had just finished questioning a witness in a bank robbery case and was getting ready for her lunch break when the phone rang. The dispatcher's voice sounded tense, even by Los Angeles Police Department standards. "Detective King, go to Cedar Hills Hospital on Sunset immediately. We have a situation with multiple unidentified bodies in the morgue. Your partner is already on his way." Aisha grabbed her jacket and rushed to her car. In her 18 years on the force, she had investigated dozens of murders, but cases involving multiple victims always caused her particular concern. Cedar Hills Hospital was one of the most prestigious private clinics in the city, serving wealthy clients from Beverly Hills and the surrounding area. What could have happened in a place like this? Wesley Reed was already waiting for her at the main entrance to the hospital. The young detective looked excited but composed, exactly the reaction required at such crime scenes. Despite the difference in age and experience, they had worked well together for 3 years. "What do we have?" Aisha asked, quickly heading for the elevator. 11 unaccounted bodies in the hospital morgue. A technician discovered them this morning during a routine inspection. All the freezers are sealed and forensic experts are already working on site. The hospital administration is in complete shock. The elevator took them to the basement, where the morgue was located. The hallway was filled with people in protective suits, forensic scientists, medical examiners, and hospital staff. The air was thick with the chemical smell of disinfectants and something else that Aisha chose not to analyze. The department's chief medical examiner, Dr. Kevin Miller, approached the detectives with a grim expression on his face. "This is unprecedented," he said, removing his gloves. 11 bodies, all in various stages of decomposition. Some have clearly been here for several months. A preliminary examination shows that none of them died of natural causes. Aisha felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. "What do you mean by unnatural causes?" "Signs of medical intervention that don't match the causes of death listed on the medical records. Some show signs of having been given drugs that should not have been used for their conditions. It will take time for a full analysis, but these are definitely not accidental deaths." At that moment, a woman in a white coat approached them. She was tall, around 40 years old, with short dark hair and piercing eyes. Despite her professional composure, her face reflected deep shock. "Detectives, I am Dr. Rachel Harris, Chief Medical Officer at Cedar Hills Hospital. I want to assure you that our administration will cooperate fully with the investigation. What has happened is contrary to all of our principles and standards." Wesley took out his notebook. "Dr. Harris, when was the last time a full inventory of the morgue was conducted?" "Regular checks are conducted weekly, but the last comprehensive inventory was 3 months ago. I don't understand how this could have gone unnoticed for so long." Dr. Harris's voice trembled with indignation and fear. Aisha studied the chief physician's face closely, looking for signs of lying or withholding information, but saw only genuine shock. This either meant that Dr. Harris really knew nothing, or she was an excellent actress. "We'll need a list of all employees with access to the morgue, as well as records of all entries and exits for the past 6 months," she said. Of course, everything will be provided immediately. They were joined by an agitated middle-aged man in a work uniform, Dennis Cole, the technician who had discovered the bodies. His hands were still shaking slightly. "Detectives, I've been working here for 8 years and I've never seen anything like this. It's just not possible. We have the strictest record-keeping of all bodies. Every movement is recorded." "Tell us more about what happened this morning," Aisha asked. Dennis took a deep breath. "I came to work as usual at 7 in the morning. The first thing I did was check the log. I needed to prepare Mr. Evans' body for transfer to Johnson's funeral home. I opened freezer number 7 and there were 3 people instead of 1. Did you check the other freezers right away?" "Yes, I was in shock, but I realized I had to check them all." It took about half an hour. There were additional bodies in 5 freezers. I immediately called security and management. There was a noise in the hallway. Aisha turned and saw a group of people heading toward the elevator, apparently journalists with cameras and microphones. Somehow, the news had already leaked to the press. "Dr. Harris, do you have a separate entrance we can use to leave the building? It seems the media already knows what's going on." The chief physician nodded, her face becoming even more alarmed. "Yes, there is a service exit through the staff parking lot. But I'm afraid this is only the beginning. Cedar Hills is too well known a hospital for a story like this to go unnoticed." Indeed, when the detectives went upstairs an hour later, a crowd of journalists had already gathered in front of the main entrance to the hospital. But what was even worse was that there were people there who clearly had nothing to do with the press. They were relatives of patients who had heard the news on the morning reports. An elderly woman in a black coat waved a photograph and shouted, "Where is my daughter? She died here 2 months ago, but her body disappeared from the funeral home. What did you do with her?" Hospital security tried to maintain order, but the situation was clearly getting out of control. Aisha realized that this was only the beginning of a real nightmare for everyone involved. Back at the morgue, the detectives continued to question the staff. One of the first to approach them was a young nurse with a name tag that read Tiffany Bell on her uniform. She looked just as shocked as the others. "I just can't believe it," she said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "I've been working here for 4 years, and this place has always been a model of professionalism. How could this have happened?" "Nurse Bell, do you often go down to the morgue?" Wesley asked. "Not very often, only when I need to accompany a body after a patient's death. Usually, the hospital's special transport service takes care of that. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Maybe one of your colleagues was acting strangely, or you had suspicions about what was going on?" Tiffany shook her head. "No, absolutely nothing. Everyone was working as usual. Although..." She paused, clearly remembering something. "What is it?" Aisha asked with interest. "It probably doesn't mean anything, but several times in the last few months, I've seen some doctors staying late for no apparent reason. But that's normal for our profession. People devote all their time to their work." A voice from behind the detectives interrupted the conversation. Turning around, they saw an elegant woman in a surgical gown. It was Dr. Chanel Green, one of the hospital's leading cardiac surgeons. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I overheard your conversation. I want to say that we are all absolutely shocked by what has happened. In 20 years of medical practice, I have never encountered anything like this." Dr. Green looked genuinely shaken. Her hands trembled slightly, and her voice sounded agitated but controlled. "If there is anything I can do to help with the investigation, please don't hesitate to ask. We all need to find out what happened here as soon as possible. The reputation of our hospital and the trust of our patients are at stake." Aisha studied the surgeon's face intently. Dr. Green gave the impression of a highly professional individual who was genuinely concerned about the fate of her workplace. "Dr. Green, how often do you go down to the morgue?" "Quite rarely. Usually only in the event of a patient's death during or immediately after surgery, when additional documentation is required." but that happens no more than once a month. Have you noticed anything unusual in your colleagues' behavior lately? Dr. Green thought for a moment. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps some nervousness due to the increased inspections by insurance companies, but that's normal for our field. The detectives spent the entire day at the hospital interviewing staff and reviewing documents. By evening, they had several working theories about what was happening. "What do you think?" Aisha asked as they finally left the building through the service exit. Wesley leafed through his notes. "It's too early to draw conclusions, but there are several possibilities. Perhaps it's revenge by a former employee. We need to check everyone who has been fired in the last 2 years, or an outside criminal who somehow gained access to the hospital. The third possibility is problems with funeral services. Maybe someone was trying to cover up traces of fraud." When they stepped outside, they saw that the situation at the main entrance had only gotten worse. The crowd of relatives and journalists had grown, and several police cars were trying to maintain order. Reporters were interviewing people who were crying and waving photos of their deceased loved ones. "This is just the beginning," Aisha said grimly. "Tomorrow, the whole country will be talking about Cedar Hills Medical Center." Aisha's predictions came true with frightening accuracy. By the next morning, the story of the mysterious bodies at Cedar Hills Hospital was the top news story on all Los Angeles television stations and internet portals. By noon, it was in the national news, and by evening, it was being discussed on social media across the country. Hospital of Death, the mystery of the refrigerators, the cemetery in the basement. The headlines became increasingly sensational. CNN sent a special camera crew to Los Angeles, and NBC's morning show devoted an entire segment to the story. Aisha and Wesley arrived at the hospital at 8 a.m. and struggled to make their way through the crowd of journalists and activists. Overnight, the number of people at the main entrance had tripled. Relatives of the victims held posters with photos of their loved ones and demanded justice. "They killed my mother and hid her body," shouted a middle-aged woman into the microphone of an ABC7 reporter. "We paid for the funeral, and she wasn't even in the coffin. How many more people have they deceived?" A man in a wheelchair waved medical documents. "My wife died here 3 months ago from cancer. We were told that her body was taken to the crematorium, but now I realize she could have been one of those found in the freezers." The hospital security guards were clearly not prepared for such an influx of people. The police set up additional barriers, but the crowd was becoming increasingly aggressive. The detectives struggled to make their way into the building through the service entrance. Captain James Finch, head of the homicide division, was waiting for them in the lobby. His usually impassive face showed extreme concern. "King, Reed, we have serious problems," he said without preamble. "The mayor called half an hour ago. He demands results as soon as possible. The press is turning this into a national scandal, and the victims' families are already filing a class action lawsuit against the hospital." Aisha nodded. "We understand, Captain. We're working around the clock. That's not enough. The mayor has scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning and wants to hear concrete results. Not suspicions, not theories. Results. What do you have at this point?" Wesley opened his notebook. "We've checked all employees who've had access to the morgue in the last 6 months. We've also reviewed security system recordings and started matching the bodies we found with missing patients. And? So far, there are a few suspicious points. Morgue technician Dennis Cole had financial problems. His house is in danger of foreclosure. Night guard Robert Peters was fired from his previous job for theft. And there's a former hospital employee, anesthesiologist Michael Brown, who was fired 8 months ago for violating protocols." Captain Finch frowned. "Is that all?" "We're just getting started, sir. This is a complex case with multiple victims. You don't have time. Find the killer, and find him fast." After the captain left, the detectives headed to the makeshift investigation room provided by the hospital administration. Dr. Harris met them at the door, looking even more exhausted than the day before. "Detectives, the situation is getting out of control," she said. pointing to the window from which the crowd of protesters was visible. Patients are canceling surgeries. Shareholders are demanding explanations. If this continues, we will have to close the hospital. Dr. Harris, we understand the pressure you're under, Aisha replied, but the investigation takes time. Rushing it could lead to mistakes. We don't have time. Every hour of delay costs us millions of dollars and destroys a reputation that took decades to build. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Nurse Tiffany Bell entered with a stack of medical records. Sorry to bother you, but you asked me to bring all the files on the patients whose bodies were found in the morgue. Wesley took the folders and began looking through them. What can you tell me about these patients? Tiffany nervously smoothed her hair. They were all pretty serious cases. Mr. Johnson came in with a heart attack, Mrs. Williams with complications from diabetes, Mr. Davis after a car accident. Most of them were in critical condition. Were they treated by different doctors? Yes, they were patients from different departments, cardiology, surgery, intensive care. They didn't have a common doctor. Aisha studied the medical records carefully. That's strange. It says here that they all died from complications of their underlying diseases, but the expert says there are signs of medical intervention. Maybe someone forged the documents after they died, Wesley suggested. Dr. Harris looked increasingly alarmed. That's impossible. We have the strictest control over document flow. Every entry is certified with the doctor's electronic signature, but someone was able to hide 11 bodies in your hospital morgue, Aisha reminded her. At noon, the mayor of Los Angeles held an emergency press conference. Eric Garcetti spoke to a crowd of journalists on the steps of City Hall, while detectives watched the broadcast on television in the investigation room. The citizens of Los Angeles have a right to know the truth about what happened at Cedar Hills Hospital, the mayor said. I am personally overseeing the investigation and demanding full accountability from the police department. Those responsible will be severely punished, and the families of the victims will receive justice. Journalists bombarded the mayor with questions. Mr. Mayor, how many victims are there? Are there any suspects? Do you plan to close the hospital until the investigation is complete? The mayor's answers were evasive, but his message was clear. Results were needed immediately, and the political careers of many people depended on the speed with which the case was solved. After the press conference, the detectives focused on checking their main suspects. First, they questioned Dennis Cole, the morgue technician. Mr. Cole, tell us about your financial problems, Aisha began. Dennis rubbed his hands nervously. Yes, I have debts on my mortgage, but that doesn't mean I'm capable of murder. I'm just a technician. I don't have access to medical drugs or equipment. But you have keys to all the freezers. Many employees have keys. Besides, I was the one who discovered the bodies. Why would I draw attention to my own crimes? Dennis's logic sounded convincing, but the detectives knew that criminals sometimes deliberately find evidence to divert suspicion from themselves. Next was the interrogation of security guard Robert Peters. The man, who was about 50 years old, overweight, and had tired eyes, gave the impression of someone broken by life. Yes, I was fired from my previous job for stealing money from the safe, he admitted. But that was several years ago, and I've changed. I work honestly at Cedar Hills. You have access to all areas of the hospital at night, Wesley noted. Technically, yes, but all my rounds are recorded by the security system. Check the records. I always did my rounds strictly according to schedule. The detectives did check the records, and they confirmed the security guard's words. Robert Peters performed his duties diligently and never stayed in the morgue longer than he was supposed to. The most intriguing suspect turned out to be Dr. Michael Brown, a former anesthesiologist at the hospital. He had been fired 8 months ago after a series of complaints about his behavior in the operating room. Dr. Brown had conflicts with the administration, Dr. Harris said. There were complaints about his rude treatment of patients and colleagues, plus suspicions of drug abuse. What drugs exactly? Aisha asked. Morphine, fentanyl, standard anesthetics. He had problems with drug accounting, Several times the balances didn't add up. It looked promising. Dr. Brown had the knowledge, the means, and the motive for the murders. But when detectives tried to locate him, it turned out that he had left Los Angeles immediately after his dismissal, and his whereabouts were unknown. "Put out a warrant for his arrest," Captain Finch ordered. "This Brown is our prime suspect." But even as the search for the former anesthesiologist continued, the situation around the hospital continued to escalate. By the third day, the protests by the victims' relatives had turned into full-blown riots. The crowd broke several windows on the first floor, and special police units had to be called in to maintain order. "They're murderers! They're all murderers!" shouted an elderly woman, waving her cane in the direction of the hospital building. "They killed my son and hid his body." Fox News aired a special report on the culture of death in American hospitals, and a California congressman called for a federal investigation into the state's entire healthcare system. Dr. Harris was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "We're being accused of all mortal sins," she complained to the detectives. "Our parent company's stock has fallen 40%. If this continues, we'll have to declare bankruptcy." During this tense time, Nurse Tiffany Bell suddenly remembered several details that could prove important. "You know, detectives," she said during another interrogation, "I remembered something strange. A few months ago, I noticed that some drugs were disappearing from the cabinets faster than usual. Not narcotics, they are strictly accounted for, but regular medications." "Which ones?" Wesley asked. "Potassium chloride, for example, or digoxin, drugs that can be dangerous in large doses, but are commonly used to treat heart disease." Aisha perked up. "And who had access to these drugs?" "Pretty much all the doctors and nurses, but I remember seeing doctors staying late at the hospital a few times for no apparent reason, especially after patients died. Can you name names?" Tiffany thought for a moment. Dr. Green, Dr. Miller from cardiology, Dr. Stewart from surgery, but that might not mean anything. Doctors often work overtime. "What exactly did you find strange about their behavior?" "Well, for example, Doctor, Green went down to the morgue several times late at night. When I asked her what she was doing there, she said she was checking the paperwork, but that's usually done in the morning." The detectives wrote down this information, but didn't attach much importance to it. Dr. Green seemed like a conscientious doctor who was genuinely concerned about what was happening. Meanwhile, the search for Dr. Brown had yielded results. He was found in a motel in San Francisco, where he was hiding under an assumed name. When he was arrested, a large amount of cash and forged documents were found in his possession. "It's him," Captain Finch said confidently. "Motive, opportunity, attempt to flee, classic picture." Dr. Brown was taken to Los Angeles for questioning. He was a thin man of about 45 with nervous movements and a shifty gaze, the typical portrait of a drug abuser. "Dr. Brown, why were you hiding from the police?" Aisha began the interrogation. "I knew I would be accused. It's always the fault of the person who was fired," he replied aggressively. "But I didn't kill those people." "You had serious conflicts with the hospital administration." "Conflicts, yes. Murders, no. I may not be a perfect person, but I'm a doctor. I save lives. I don't take them." "Then explain why you have fake documents and $50,000 in cash." Dr. Brown paused, clearly thinking about what to say. "Okay. I was involved in the illegal trade of prescription drugs. I sold painkillers to people who couldn't get them legally. But that's not murder. Admitting to drug trafficking was a serious crime, but it didn't explain the 11 bodies in the hospital freezers. Furthermore, Dr. Brown had been fired 8 months ago, and some of the bodies found had been in the morgue for only a few weeks, according to experts. He has an alibi for the last few months, Wesley reported after checking. Neighbors in San Francisco confirmed that he has lived there since he was fired. Plus, motel surveillance footage shows him there on the critical dates. Aisha felt disappointed. Dr. Brown seemed like the perfect suspect, but his alibi destroyed the whole theory. The investigation had reached a dead end, and the pressure on the police was mounting. The mayor called Captain Finch daily, demanding progress reports. The media called the case a disgrace to American medicine, and the victims' relatives filed a $100 million class action lawsuit against the hospital. At that time, a technician from the crime lab approached the detectives with preliminary test results. "We have some interesting information about the cause of death," she said. "All 11 victims died of an overdose of drugs commonly used in cardiac surgery. Potassium chloride, digoxin, propranolol. Does that confirm the murder theory?" "Definitely." The doses were lethal, and the drugs were administered intravenously. Someone with medical training deliberately killed these people, Aisha thought for a moment. "So the killer is a doctor or nurse working at the hospital. Not necessarily currently employed, but definitely someone with access to the drugs and knowledge of their use." The detectives reviewed the list of all hospital employees with access to the drugs in question. The list turned out to be quite long, more than 30 people. "We need to narrow down the circle of suspects," Wesley said. "Maybe we should take a closer look at the doctors who worked with the most victims?" They began to draw up a diagram showing which doctors had dealt with each of the murdered patients. The picture was confusing. The victims had been in different wards and treated by different specialists. "Wait," said Aisha, studying the documents carefully. "What if the killer chose the victims not based on the attending physician, but on some other criterion?" "What do you mean?" "Well, for example, all these patients were in serious condition. Perhaps the killer thought he was helping them avoid suffering? Like an angel of mercy? There have been many such cases in the history of medicine. They began to study the psychological profiles of all the hospital staff, but it was a long and painstaking task, and they had almost no time left. On the 5th day of the investigation, something happened that changed the entire course of the case. A technical employee of the hospital security service brought the detectives a flash drive with surveillance camera recordings. "Detectives, I reviewed all the recordings from the last 3 months, as you requested," he said, "and I found something interesting." A black and white image of the corridor leading to the morgue appeared on the computer screen. The time on the recording was 2 a.m. "Look closely," said the technician, pointing to a figure in a white coat walking down the corridor. "This is a recording from September 15th, the day after Mr. Davis's death. The figure was barely visible in the dim light of the night corridor, but it was clear that it was a person in a medical uniform carrying some kind of bag." "Can you zoom in on the image?" Aisha asked. "The quality isn't very good, but I'll try." The enlarged image revealed that it was a woman of medium height with short, dark hair. It was impossible to make out her face, but the silhouette seemed familiar. "Are there recordings from other cameras for the same period?" "Yes, but the person clearly knew the location of the cameras and avoided being caught on camera. This recording is the only one where the figure is fully visible." Wesley studied the image carefully. "Look at the way she moves, her posture. She's clearly a medical professional. You can tell by her professional gait. And most likely someone who knows the hospital well. A novice wouldn't be able to avoid the cameras so skillfully." The detectives asked the technician to find similar recordings for other dates. A few hours later, they had a collection of 7 video clips showing the mysterious figure on different nights. All of the recordings were made within 24 hours of the victims being found, Aisha noted. "That can't be a coincidence." So the killer returned to move the bodies to the freezers. He probably hid them somewhere else first, then found an opportunity to take them down to the morgue. Suddenly, Wesley froze, staring intently at one of the frames. "Aisha, look here. Do you see that bag in our suspect's hands?" "Yes, a medical bag. So what?" "Now think about it. Which of the hospital doctors always carries a bag like that? I've only seen one person with it." Aisha thought hard, remembering all the doctors they had talked to over the past few days. Suddenly, it dawned on her. Dr. Green. She's the only one who always carries a vintage leather doctor's bag. She said it was a gift from her father. They looked at each other silently. realizing the significance of this discovery. Dr. Chanel Green was a respected cardiac surgeon who had expressed sincere shock at what was happening and was actively assisting with the investigation. By the 6th day of the investigation, the story of Cedar Hills Hospital had become more than just news. It had turned into a national obsession. CNN broadcast live from the scene every hour. The crowd outside the hospital had grown to several hundred people, including patient rights activists, journalists from across the country, and relatives of victims from different states. Aisha and Wesley understood that they were no longer working on just another murder case. The whole country was watching them. Their every move was analyzed and commented on in real time. Reporters waited for them at the entrance to the police station, trying to find out details of the investigation. The discovery of the video footage radically changed the direction of the investigation. Analysis of all the recordings showed that the mysterious figure with the distinctive bag appeared in the hospital corridors on the very nights when the bodies of deceased patients disappeared. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. "We need a search warrant for Dr. Green's home," Aisha told Captain Finch. "We have sufficient grounds." "The video recordings are not clear enough for positive identification," the captain objected. "The lawyers will tear this case to shreds." But combined with other evidence, access to drugs, knowledge of the hospital, the distinctive bag, it could work. Captain Finch hesitated. Searching the home of a respected doctor without solid evidence could be disastrous for the department, especially under the scrutiny of the media. "All right," he finally agreed, "but proceed with caution. If we're wrong, the media storm will wipe us all out." It took several hours to obtain the warrant. The judge carefully reviewed all the case materials before signing. By evening, the documents were ready. Dr. Green lived in an elegant Spanish-style house in the prestigious Beverly Hills neighborhood. The detectives waited until she left for work before approaching the house. They didn't want to cause a public scene that would inevitably attract the attention of neighbors and journalists. "Remember, we're looking for any documents related to the victims, medical supplies, photographs," Aisha reminded the group of forensic scientists. Dr. Green's house struck them with its immaculateness. Everything was neatly arranged, each item in its place. A snow-white kitchen, a living room with expensive furniture, a library with medical journals, a typical home of a successful doctor. The search began in the study on the second floor. The desk was perfectly organized, with documents neatly arranged in folders. Too neat for an ordinary person. "Look at this," Wesley called out, opening one of the desk drawers. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with Dr. Green's neat handwriting. The detectives began to read and felt a chill run down their spines. "Mr. Johnson, 72 years old. Stage 4 heart failure. Suffering will continue for months. Decision made. Mrs. Williams, 68 years old. Diabetic coma. Family clinging to false hope. Action required." Each entry contained the patient's name, diagnosis, and brief notes on the need for intervention. There were 13 entries in total in the notebook. 11 corresponded to the bodies found, and the last 2 were dated the day before yesterday and yesterday. "She planned to kill 2 more, Wesley said grimly. In the next box, they found even more shocking discoveries. Photographs of all the victims, clearly taken secretly in hospital wards. In some of the pictures, the patients were asleep. In others, they were talking to relatives. Dr. Green watched them, studied them, chose them. "It's a hunt," Aisha said, looking at the photos. She tracked them down like a predator. In the bedroom, they found a small safe hidden behind a painting. A locksmith from the crime lab picked the lock in a few minutes. Inside were medical vials of potassium chloride and syringes, enough of the drug to kill a dozen people. But the most gruesome discovery awaited them in the basement. In the corner, behind some old furniture, stood a refrigerator. When the forensic experts opened it, they found glass jars containing some kind of liquid and tissue samples. "What is this?" Aisha asked the medical expert. "They look like biological samples. heart, liver, and kidney tissue. The expert examined the jars carefully. She took samples from all her victims, like trophies. The picture of the crimes was becoming increasingly horrific. Dr. Green was not just an angel of death, killing out of false compassion. She was a collector who enjoyed controlling life and death. Enough evidence, Aisha decided. Let's go to the hospital and arrest her. But when the detectives arrived in Cedar Hills, they were disappointed. Dr. Green had not shown up for work that morning. Her colleagues said she had canceled all scheduled surgeries, citing illness. She realized we were close, Wesley said. She may have seen us at her house. The search for Dr. Green began immediately. Her photo was sent to all airports, train stations, and border crossings in California. State police received a description of her car, a black Mercedes E-Class. The media instantly picked up on the news that the prime suspect had fled. TV stations interrupted their programming for emergency bulletins, and the internet went into a frenzy. Killer doctor on the run. Hunt for Dr. Death. Serial killer at large. The headlines became increasingly sensational. The crowd outside the hospital reacted to the news with panic and anger. Relatives of the victims demanded her immediate arrest. Journalists besieged the police station, and a real witch hunt began on social media. "How could you let her get away?" a man shouted into a reporter's microphone. "My wife is dead and the killer is walking free." The search continued throughout the night. Patrols searched all possible places where Dr. Green could be hiding, friends' homes, hotels, rental apartments, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. The breakthrough came early the next morning. A highway patrol officer on duty spotted a black Mercedes on Highway 5 heading toward the Oregon border. The license plate matched the description. "The suspect is heading north on Highway 5, the patrolman reported over the radio, requesting backup for arrest. The chase was short. Dr. Green made no attempt to flee or resist. When the police cars blocked the road ahead, she simply stopped and calmly got out of the car. "Dr. Chanel Green, you are under arrest on suspicion of multiple murders," the officer said as he handcuffed her. "I knew this day would come," she replied quietly. "To be honest, it's a relief." News of the arrest spread instantly across all media outlets. News channel helicopters circled above the scene of the arrest, and reporters described the events live on air. Dr. Green was taken to the police station under guard and immediately placed in a holding cell. The crowd outside the police building was so aggressive that a back entrance had to be used. The official interrogation took place a few hours later in the presence of a lawyer. Dr. Green sat upright with her hands folded on the table and answered questions in a calm, almost emotionless voice. "Dr. Green, do you admit to the murder of 11 patients at Cedar Hills Hospital?" Aisha began. "Guilty of murder, no," she replied clearly. "But I admit that I helped people avoid unnecessary suffering." "You administered lethal doses of drugs without their consent." "Consent is not always possible to obtain from a person in agony." "I made decisions based on my medical experience." The lawyer tried to stop his client, but Dr. Green continued to speak with frightening calm. Each of these people was doomed to a painful death. Mr. Johnson could have lived for months in suffering from heart failure. Mrs. Williams was in a diabetic coma and would never have regained consciousness. I simply hastened the inevitable. "But why did you collect their photos? Why did you keep tissue samples?" Wesley asked. "For the first time during the entire interrogation, Dr. Green's expression changed. A strange emotion flashed in her eyes, something between pride and satisfaction. "It was my job. I wanted to remember every person I helped. The tissue samples helped me understand if I had chosen the correct dosage of medication. Did you enjoy killing them?" "I felt satisfaction from relieving people's suffering." "It's not enjoyment. It's professional duty." The detectives understood that they were dealing with a person who had created her own distorted system of ethics. In her mind, Killing patients was an act of mercy, and collecting trophies was scientific work. The public reaction to Dr. Green's confession was explosive. The victims' families couldn't believe that their loved ones had been killed under the guise of treatment. "She talks about mercy, but she killed my mother without her consent," cried the daughter of one of the victims in front of the cameras. "This is not mercy, it's cold-blooded murder." Dr. Green's colleagues at Cedar Hills Hospital were just as shocked. Nurse Tiffany Bell gave an interview to a local TV station. "I worked with her every day and never suspected a thing. She always seemed caring and professional. Now I understand what was behind it all." Dr. Harris announced her resignation. "I am responsible for what happened at my hospital," she said at a press conference, "although I knew nothing about Dr. Green's crimes. As a manager, I should have noticed the signs." Cedar Hills Hospital was temporarily closed for a full investigation. Patients were transferred to other clinics, and staff underwent additional screening. The trial lasted several months and attracted enormous media attention. Dr. Green's lawyers tried to prove her insanity, but expert testimony showed that she was fully aware of her actions. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing. Dr. Chanel Green received 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole. "Do you have any last words?" asked the judge. Dr. Green stood up and said calmly, "My only regret is that society is not ready to accept the need for such help for suffering people. History will judge my actions." Dr. Green's case became a turning point in American medicine, leading to tighter controls on medical drugs and the creation of new ethics committees. But its main legacy was the realization that even the most noble professions require constant supervision and scrutiny.